Welcome everybody to Ask the Authors, and we have a panel of writers compiled today where we discuss human-centered leadership. Let me tell you a little bit about the Hackathon, HR.Hackathon Alliance. My name is Nicole Desane. I'm the founder. At this point, we have 3,600 community members globally. And our signature event is the HR.Hackathon, which started to be in person. And at this point, we have generated over 700 ideas, which is pretty cool, with our partners who facilitate local events in several cities and supported by our sponsors. But of course, like many people and many organizations during COVID, we started also facilitating virtual events. And so this is a very new format that I'm experimenting with, which is called Ask the Authors. And it's about a human-centered theme and inviting authors who have written about this topic. So I'm super excited to have these three authors with us today, and I'm going to introduce them one by one. We're going to talk about each of their books a little bit more, and then dive into overarching human-centered questions. Again, as you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat and we'll address them throughout and at the end. All right, with having said that, I'm going to start with our first author, LaTonya Wilkins. Let me tell you a little bit about LaTonya. She's the founder of Change Coaches and author of Leading Below the Surface. LaTonya Wilkins coaches CEOs, senior executives, and teams around the world. Global leaders typically call LaTonya when they are facing the following challenges: navigating conflict in diverse teams, developing leaders to handle the increasingly complex workplace, struggling to gain alignment with their teams, and building accountable cultures of belonging. LaTonya is a sought-after coach and keynote speaker who has inspired audiences across industries. She built her career working in HR, talent management, and learning and development at Fortune 500 companies before teaching and taking on progressive leadership roles at the University of Illinois Gies College of Business. LaTonya's book, Leading Below the Surface, How to Build Real and Psychologically Safe Relationships with People Who Are Different from You, was recently featured as a top inclusion book for executives on seniorexecutive.com. And on a personal note, LaTonya and I go way back. We can't recall how we met, so we just say we know each other for a long time, and it's an honor to know her and have collaborated with her. And then I was so excited when her book came out, and in 2021. So welcome, LaTonya. Can you share a little bit with us? I know people always are interested a little bit about the behind the scenes story. What's the behind the scenes story of Leading Below the Surface? How did it come about? And maybe what were some highs and lows as you were writing the book?
Yeah, it's interesting because I wasn't one of those people that said, oh my gosh, I'm going to be an author. This is what I'm going to be when I grow up. I had many different negative experiences in the workplace, which was interesting because I was in the field that was actually supposed to make the workplace better. So I led leadership development teams globally. And I remember I loved doing what I did, but I got this weird performance review, and it had nothing. It was more about relational stuff or the lack of relational stuff, and it just changed my whole perception of the workplace. And so that's when I started looking around, and that's when I ended up getting introduced to the dean of the Gies College of Business at the University of Illinois, and he was like, "Hey, do you want to come run culture and leadership for us?" And that was interesting because I was interviewing with a lot of tech firms and tech companies. And I actually ended up doing that job for 6 years, and it really changed everything. I started doing research. I was surrounded by amazing faculty and researchers that research teams and leadership. And it was so nice and substantive, and it was a breath of fresh air to see this happening. And I started teaching. And then I became a coach. My mentor had always said, "Hey, you should be a coach." And now I see why she said that. And it was just a natural thing for me. And so then the pandemic happened, and it was 2020. It was March 2020. And I'd started thinking about writing a book, but I wasn't really sure what it was going to be. And during that time, my grandmother passed away, who was my rock. She was 93. And it was just, you know, I just had a lot of time to spend with her, what I say below the surface. And it was just beautiful. It was just beautiful how I was able to spend that time with her. And she taught me so much about relational leadership, even though, and human-centered leadership, even though that's not what she called it, but she lived it. And that's when I kind of started rethinking my life and like, wow, I need to do something different. I mean, my parents, my mom really paved the way, my grandma really paved the way. And so that's when I joined a writing boot camp, and I started getting together with some folks, and Leading Below the Surface was born, 18 months later. It was quite the process.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your story. And it kind of is a good segue actually to your book. So what I challenged myself with, which I'm like, why did I do that? So I challenged myself with picking one quote from each of the books that I like the best. Okay, so that turned out to be futile because there's just so many gems in each of those books. So what I decided that I do is I picked one that I feel reflects the tone and the form and the message of the book well. Let's just put it that way. Okay, so I did my best. So here goes the one that I picked for LaTonya, and it kind of builds on what you just said, actually. So, quote, after mortgaging my dreams for far too long, the second half of my corporate career was different. I came out. I brought more, but not all of myself to work. Every year I revealed something new, and with each revelation I felt freer. The process of growing into myself was not always completely blissful. Suddenly, not all of my coworkers accepted me. I felt excluded and even pushed out of some roles because of it. It was a risk, and the very definition of risk is that you win some and lose some. I had so much to say. Ultimately, I became a professional coach and helped people navigate the very world that was not accepting of people like me. I coached executives to build cultures of belonging, and it wasn't in the traditional ways. We got there by getting below the surface, unquote. And I picked this quote because A, it introduces the below the surface concept, which we'll talk about a little bit. But I also picked it because what to me makes, so I call your book a coach in the pocket, which I think, by the way, every manager should have it, because it's literally, you take it out and you feel like LaTonya coaches you. And I think every manager should have that, quite frankly. And what makes it so powerful to me, next, of course, to all the research that you have in there, which is very powerful, it's the personal stories like this that you share. Because, you know, and I think that was part of the attention of the book, through experiencing the business world through the eyes of somebody who, as you call it, has been othered for a long time, really helps, I think, leaders to feel as though, which we know can fully be possible, but as though they can walk in your shoes to some degree, right? So to me, these personal stories is what make this book, among so many other things, brilliant. So thank you for sharing your gifts and be very vulnerable in the stories you share, by the way. I think these are really, really brave. So can you talk a little bit about what leading below the surface means and the real leadership that you outline in the book?
Yeah, I first want to say, even like when I hear people read my book back to me, and people do that quite a bit when I do keynotes, and they'll have like, you know, what do you call those, dog ears or whatever in the book, and they'll like read it to me, and it's like, still gives me goosebumps, because yes, very personal stories. And I wrote this because, and I wrote it this way because there's not a lot out there like this, that you have these real stories, but also research that backs that we're doing this all wrong, right? And it's very forgiving. People tell me that all the time. Like, you're very forgiving. I am. I'm not like a cancel culture kind of person. Like, I'm like, okay, let's learn how to do this better. Let's try to change, you know, giving people a chance to do that. And that's what leading below the surface is. It's, you know, the other day I was talking to a group coach, and he was telling me that he's kind of been doing a lot of DEI work with white guys, And he was saying that he made a really good point that with these guys, they need to have psychological safety to learn and to get better. Otherwise, if they're not getting that safety, they're never going to get better. Or if they're getting judged, or if they make a mistake, we have to give them that safety. And that's what below the surface leadership is. It's I have 3 prongs: real leadership, which means being relatable, equitable, aware, and loyal. Like I said, I did a lot of research on leadership archetypes, and none of them really related to how we treat people. None of them really had equity in the middle. They basically, there's like inclusive leadership, but that's not really a leadership archetype. It's kind of like a side dish, right? In the main course, you're really focused on the main course, but you got the side dish over here, but you don't really need the side dish. It's not essential. And so that's where real leadership came up. And then the 2 other prongs are psychological safety, which we all probably know what that is. It's probably a pretty savvy group, being able to make mistakes without repercussions, without being judged, being able to speak up. And again, the mistakes, we have to be able to make mistakes to learn. And I call that sharing your slips. When we're going through this process, if we just continue judging each other and calling each other out instead of in, it's not going to work. And we're seeing some of that now. And so just being able to create that psychological safety. And that's why I asked Amy Edmondson to write my foreword. I mean, when she wrote my foreword, she was telling me that she hadn't really wrote about psychological safety in terms of belonging yet. And now she does a lot more now, but having that. And so, yeah, with these prongs, real leadership is very essential, as is psychological safety and empathy. I talk a lot about empathy. I won't get too much into that because I know we have some other authors here that could probably speak to that as well. But you have to have empathy in your interactions, and being empathetic doesn't mean that you're being a pushover, doesn't mean you're being soft. There's a big difference between being nice and being kind. I think the latter we need more of. And so it's really just kind of just reimagining all this stuff, like incorporate, the meritocracies. I have a whole chapter about that, half a chapter, where it's not about that. It's about, getting below the surface, connecting with people, building real relationships across differences.
Wow, thank you so much. Now I get goosebumps again. Every time I reread your book, I hear you speak. It is so powerful. And thank you for sharing and being here. Ensuite, Celine Schillinger de France. Bonjour. Welcome. Now we got to switch back to English.
Yeah.
That's all my French, but yeah, we got an international author group here today. So from the US all the way to France. Welcome, welcome. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you, everybody.
Yeah, so let me tell you a little bit about Celine. Celine Schillinger is the author of the Porchlight 2022 Leadership Book of the Year, Dare to Unlead, The Art of Relational Leadership in a Fragmented World. An award-winning French entrepreneur, change practitioner, and consultant, Celine has over 30 years of field experience working with both small and global organizations across several continents. A blogger since 2015 and a TEDx speaker, she was knighted by the French government for her workplace change efforts. In 2022, Celine received the Internet Time Alliance J. Cross Memorial Award, and in 2023, she was recognized once again among the 101 global influencers in employee engagement and employee experience. Welcome, Celine. And I do remember how we met. I don't know if you remember, but so we were, I think, I don't know if it's 6 years ago or whatever, but you were still at Sanofi.
Yeah.
And we were both part of a future work think tank founded by Professor John Boudreau, right?
Yes.
And we were, which is kind of ironic right now, and we were attending a summit at back then Twitter headquarters in San Francisco.
Yes.
So,
I stumbled upon the picture recently. I was so proud to be there. Now
I was actually thinking, I mean, your book came out in 2022.
Yeah.
He didn't make it quite in part one of your books. So we'll talk about that a little bit. But so that's how we met. So same as with the others, Celine. Can you share a little bit behind the scenes, the story of Dare to Unlead? How did it come about? What were some ups and lows as you were writing the book?
Yes. So I think just like LaTonya, I had never thought of myself as a writer. It really did not occur to me until very, very late, until I spent almost 30 years in the corporate life, in the corporate world, and I feel also pretty disappointed by how we make people work along what I thought were very outdated principles and very cruel. Also, a lot of the workplace relationships are based on humiliation, and even and people internalize that and accept being treated really poorly. And um and I for some years I've been trying. First, I think I was blind to those kind of things, those workplace pathologies, and then I became angry, and then I started to try new things. I started to do things and to try to change things. But over the years, my perspective on my own change efforts has evolved. Of course, I think has become, I mean, hopefully more subtle, and I think I've integrated more of the complexity of the world, and I've understood that you can't push change at people, and you really need to build it with them, even those who disagree with you. That's probably the hardest thing. And I left the corporate world in 2018, came back from the US, back to Europe. And after a couple years, I thought I'm not going to be able to, grow if I just stick to old stories. I need to really go deep into, like, I need to question my own knowledge, which comes very much from the field. I need to question that, to challenge it, to learn more, and to really dive into knowledge. And that's what I did for the book. So it was really a research project for me. I wanted to understand why this thing, engagement, mobilization, community building, all those things I had seen work really well in the innovative projects I had been involved in. Why do they work? And how can we make more of that in the workplace? And I was also I wanted to deconstruct a little bit this fascination we have for leadership. That's why I call my book Unlead, Dare to Unlead. I'm a bit tired, honestly, of all this emphasis, this focus, almost this religion where we have built around leadership as if leadership was, the one thing that would save us. And I think it's not. I think it's contributing. This worshipping of leaders is contributing to the problems, and we really need to develop agency, mutual accountability, respect, equality, and that's what led me to write. And so it was. I started the project a little bit before COVID. I put everything on hold when we got locked down, and then started back again. I thought, okay, now is the time. I really need to write, to put these ideas together. And it's a sort of I'm telling my own story a little bit like LaTonya, I think as well, and I'm trying to honor all the thinkers and practitioners and co-workers, etc., who have been along with me on this journey. And so it's someone described it as a giant canvas. I'm weaving a lot of threads in this book, and it's organized around three principles: liberty, equality, and fraternity. Not just because I'm French, but because I didn't want to bring yet another framework to the world. I think we are dying under the abundance of frameworks, and I didn't want to further feed this habit of consuming ready digested ideas, or implement, or bringing in ideas coming from other contexts, and applying them blindly, and that's when they become toxic. So instead, I wanted to bring, to invite people to maybe think together around values instead. And so it's been a really amazing time to dive into all this knowledge and to really research. And I wish it was painful to write. It was delightful to learn. And I'll stop here. I think Rhonda could talk about my book even better than I could, I think.
Well, maybe Rhonda can add some commentary in the comments. But thank you so much for that introduction. And so this is the quote that I picked from your book. Quote, "A movement toward more liberty, equality, and fraternity at work starts, as we have seen, with an individual distancing themselves from a dominant model, one inherited from the past, which has become restrictive and counterproductive, with others eventually electing to do the same. At the beginning, there's personal risk-taking and a sense of both refusal and encouragement, even if this sense only takes the form of a voice in the change agent's head telling them no, partly in disgust at what is, partly in disbelief at what might be, partly in recognition of the rules and norms that constrain them. In The Rebel, an examination of the development of revolutionary thought, Albert Camus wrote, 'I rebel, therefore we exist.' That phrase could sum up the essence of this book." Unquote. So yeah, so I chose this book, this quote, because again, it references a French philosopher, which there's a theme in your book around it, and it sums up similar to what it's interesting how both of you summarized your book sort of, and then I picked a quote actually that fits. That was, man, maybe I am better than I thought. Anyways, it's all about me. So you said somebody called your book like a canvas. To me, the term that comes to my mind when I read it or came is manifesto. To me, it's a manifesto. And in part one, actually, so my husband is American, I'm German, and part one of your book is what my husband would call a German film, meaning it is very somber. It is it lays out a very bleak state of the union. One might say crisis of leadership that we find ourselves in business, in politics, and in science. And you share plenty of examples that are, I think, unfortunately familiar to most of us. So that's how part one starts, as a depressing German movie. And then, of course, the next parts are very French. So then you introduce the framework that you just mentioned that are based on the principles of the French Revolution, liberté, égalité, et fraternité. And that's kind of the framework. You said it's not a framework, but it's a way of organizing your thoughts, I guess, and let's put it that way.
Exactly.
And that then, and maybe that's the French versus the German, is hopeful, right? So then you lay out the crisis, but then, okay, these are some of the things we can do. So maybe can you summarize a little bit more?
Sure.
What is behind each of these three building blocks?
So liberty is very much about agency. It's about injecting more agency in the system rather than less. We are being robotized by our workplaces, and this is actually detrimental to human health, to mental health, and to our relationships, to society, and also to business efficiency, because we're very poor robots. And an agency, injecting more freedom in the system rather than less, starts with questioning our own role in maintaining, perpetuating obsolete patterns. So it's taking a distance, being able to see the system in which we operate and what we actually maintain of this system and what we could change by changing conversations, by changing relational approaches and so on. So that's the first principle, agency, starting with self-empowerment. And the second principle is a principle of equality in access to information, equality in diversity, understanding that there are no perspectives that are better than others in an organization, and certainly not better than another because it's higher in the hierarchy. They are just different perspectives, and the system will win if it, at every level, is able to handle more of its own complexity. So that's where networks as technologies, but also as organizing principles, are immensely useful by enabling information to flow more easily, more widely, and faster across the diversity of the network. And finally, how do we keep this network together? The idea is here to develop a sense of willful togetherness, this sense of fraternity, this sense of joy in working together that makes people want to collaborate, want to be together. And I feel here that there's a lot to learn from social movements, from community building, that manage to gather the momentum, that create momentum and really unite people without the need for extensive bureaucracy, rules, processes, etc. So we can learn from these movements and implement some of that in the workplace. And I know it works because I've seen that in practice several times. So I bring several examples, studies, and so on. And so all this is a way to suggest another understanding of leadership. In my opinion, leadership is not an individual skill set that is attached to a certain assertiveness or certain qualities we tend to look for in leaders, and certainly not something that puts some people above others. In my opinion, leadership is a collective capacity that stems from relational capabilities, relational skills in people. And it's not less work than the old-fashioned leadership of today. It's more work, but it's a work through which you sort of you aspire to disappear in the collective instead of stepping upon people, instead of standing above everybody else. Really trying to disappear in the collective, making the collective so efficient, so effective that it can work without you. And so then that makes you free to go on and pollinate other collectives.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing all your insights and research and personal experience and stories and wisdom with us in your book. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And last but not least, and I'm not gonna try to emulate an English accent, so that will only result in ridicule. So welcome, Julian Stodd. Let me tell you a little bit about Julian. Julian Stodd is a researcher and author of 17 books exploring the context of the social age, examining the impacts on leadership, learning, and culture in a time of radical connectivity and technological change. His work on social leadership examines how we lead at the intersection of systems between the formal and social. His latest book, The Humble Leader, is a guided reflection into the self that we carry into our systems. So I do not know Julian in person. How I learned about his book, The Humble Leader, is kind of coincidental. I think it actually, so what I saw, it popped up. He did a Kickstarter campaign for his book. And I think, so this beautiful, I'm a sucker for hand-drawn images. So not only is Julian an author, I think he's also an artist. So this beautiful leaf, hand-drawn leaf one day popped up in my Twitter feed, I think. And I'm like, oh, hand-drawn, let me click on it. And it led me to his Kickstarter campaign for this book, which, so I call it actually leadership poetry. This to me, I don't know if I'm making up a new genre, but this to me, what Julian produced is leadership poetry. And so I contributed to his Kickstarter campaign, and then this beautiful thing with a dedication and a handwritten letter came in the mail. And so thank you for that. So that was my introduction to Julian. And then I just reached out for this discussion, because as I was conceiving of this conversation around human-centered leadership, coincidentally, all your 3 books were sitting in front of me. And then I made the connection that even though they're so different in format and style, the core essence of what you're all writing about is very, very similar. So thank you, Julian, for, without knowing me, agreeing to join us today and sharing your gifts with us. So same to you. Can you tell us a little bit the behind the scenes of The Humble Leader? How did it come about? What were some highs and lows as you were writing the book?
Yeah, well, thank you for supporting that new work. I really appreciate that. And also for inviting me along today and to have the opportunity to hear LaTonya and Celine sharing their work has been a really nice end to a very busy week. So I appreciate you bringing this group together. I can't tell as elegant a story as the others have shared, because my work is relatively imperfect and quite fragile in its way. And the humble leader sits right on the edge of it. So my work is research-led, and some of that produces quite hard and sharp work on, as you say, leadership at the intersection, the work on social leadership, the research around community building, the work on the socially dynamic organization. That work I'm quite comfortable with. It's developed, it iterates. But in the midst of the pandemic, I wanted to create an open body of work, which is called Quiet Leadership, which explores leadership in the smallest of actions. And I normally introduce that work by saying when organizations talk about leadership, they describe a journey of 10,000 steps. And this is about the first 3. So Quiet Leadership just describes you and I within a system today and the way that we are with each other. It is research-led, but it's very qualitative, it's very subjective, and it considers humility, kindness, fairness, and grace, the gracefulness of our action. So I rather naively put that work together, and it runs as an open program. We've had thousands of people from around the world taking part in that program. It's based on 8 conversations with strangers. I just bring people together from all over the world, I think 46 countries so far. And rather embarrassingly, it sort of exploded. It just became very popular. And I found it sort of interesting because it really is on the softest edge of my work, but it nonetheless started to challenge my own thinking. So I wanted to build some of the work out. And so I turned back to that first topic, the question of humility. In the Quiet Leadership work, I talk about the organization as an ecosystem, an idea that we can all see the landscape, but none of us individually can care for all of it. So I can look after a garden, and you could look after a field, and maybe Celine is walking down the path by the river and picking up some rubbish that she sees. You know, each of us do good things. Each of us tend to and care for that system. And yet none of us individually can make the system healthy. So if the river becomes polluted or the skies fill with ash, we all suffer. It's a cheap metaphor for culture of an organization. But I became interested in that in the way that we all breathe in and we all breathe out. You know, what if we don't think that there are good and bad people in systems? There are just people in systems. And, you know, most people operate according to their local version of good. It just might not match up with my version of good. So this work was really about understanding that and asking people to question how they operate in the light, but we all cast a shadow. That's the language that we use in that work, that we each cast a shadow. And sometimes those shadows intersect and they fall over people. People get left without a voice. Their voice is taken from them. They cannot escape from it. So when I came to the Humble Leader, I went back to work I'd first done in 2012, talking about social justice, when I was in San Francisco, working with some homeless communities, looking at notions of civil society and the ways that we treat each other. I tried to develop that work through further writing on fairness, but none of it had really landed, which is very common in my work. It's often iterative. I say it's often imperfect. And then a weird sort of thing happened. I just sat down to write that. And the book is very short. It's only 3,500 words. You know, I can read it cover to cover before my coffee gets cold. And it's funny that you used that word poetic, because I think it is poetic. It's not intentionally so. It just kind of fell out of me like that. And when I read through it for the last time, before it went off to the printers, I thought I can't write anything else. I couldn't write another chapter for this work because I don't think I have that voice kind of inside me anymore. It just, I just feel it just came together as it was meant to be. But it's not a book of any kind of answers. It's certainly not a book with any kind of frameworks. It's shared as my own journey. And I've become increasingly interested since actually the book that Celine waved around, the Social Leadership, My First 100 Days, was the first book I wrote deliberately to include space. I then wrote a book, The Trust Sketchbook, which included more space. And this book absolutely includes space. It comes with an encouragement to graffiti it, to deface it, to add your comments to it, to illustrate it, to make it your own. And it just kind of felt in my own writing journey, it just felt like the right book at the right time. But I was very nervous about releasing it because it has almost nothing in it. You know, it's really me rambling from section to section on some stuff that I think is important, but not particularly with any expectation that that is what anybody else should feel is important. So I've been really touched by how kindly people have received it. I suspect partly, you know, out of kindness. I couldn't swear to what people take away from it, but I think that's okay. This body of work around quiet leadership, I quite often describe as being about imperfect leadership. You know, what if there is no perfect model? What if we're just stumbling our way through and generally well-intentioned, generally good, generally making mistakes, generally trying to figure out where the path goes? Maybe that's okay, as long as we take time to be in our practice. And that language is something I've been using increasingly in the body of work around social leadership daily. The notion that what really matters is to be within your practice, to pause, to look around you, and to see how you can change.
Mm-hmm. Well, this was certainly a very humble introduction of the book. And so let me read the quote that I picked from your book. Quote, "Words change everything, from the softest whisper to the loudest shout. Cries of hope or pain. How will your words touch the world? How will you listen to the words of others? Will you be known for the picture of strength that you project, or for the shadow that you cast in your wake? Being a humble leader may require bold action, but action not for self, but for others. Words spoken not in vanity, but generosity. Actions taken in service of others, not to take more for ourselves. Our humble leadership is a reflection, a journey. Consider the traces of your actions, the faint sketch outline of the map that you make as you travel. Consider your journey and do not defer the hardest steps for tomorrow or for others to take. Step forward to be a humble leader and then carry others so that they can pass you. Not in idealism and fantasy, but in humility and kindness, with generosity and respect," unquote. And that's why I think this is leadership poetry. Maybe I didn't read it right, but to me, it's very poetic, and it gives me chills every time I read it. So I think it's not just kindness, but it's a true connection that you forged there. I'm curious, can you explain to us a little bit more what makes a humble leader?
Well, you know, I have to give you two answers for that. How I would answer it and how people answered it in the research. So in the research, it slightly surprised me. People describe humility as an active process, first of all. They don't describe it as standing here, staring in the mirror, looking at yourself. They say a humble leader is somebody who will actively reach out for feedback from multiple dimensions, which kind of sounds like a 360, to be honest. And they say they will not just take those responses and read them. They will find a group of people that they trust and they will work on themselves within it. So they describe that as a continuous and ongoing active process, which I find, you know, quite encouraging. If you asked me, I'd probably give a slightly different answer. I think humility in leadership is to recognize your own imperfection, to recognize the shadow that you cast, and to recognize that others cast shadows too. but to reach out through our differences. My work is very broad in some ways, and I found more comfort with this work recently because it does speak to interconnection through difference. And I think a humble leader is simply, if there is such a thing, I say in the book, it's a badge that's bestowed on you for starters. It's not one that you can claim. You can't just sort of buy it or say that you are. But it's somebody who's willing to engage in that, to just engage in the idea that maybe they are not their perfect self. Because I think that few of us are, or maybe we are today, but we might not be tomorrow. I don't generally have I don't have a lot of time for leadership books on the whole, because I think they're highly abstract, and they often fall into the trap of being aspirational. In the work on kindness, what we see is that people talk about kindness as being important in a system, but when you ask them to actually describe how it is spent, they describe kindness as predominantly a cohesive force, not a connective one. We're more likely to spend kindness on people we already know and like, rather than to connect through our differences with other people. And that for me says a lot about what we need to understand about leadership. It's not just about nice words that we use. It's about a recognition that the things that we think are great may be great within one context, but are not universally so. So it's not enough to say we should be kind, because we probably already are. In systems where we see harmful effects, people are often being kind, but they're reinforcing existing social connection and tribal structures. So I avoided answering your question, I realize, but I will be sure to be very helpful. Yeah.
No, but this is awesome, and thank you so much. And all three of you, I'm just in awe. So I want to spend the last 10 minutes sort of opening up for questions. If you guys, and I was just catching up also in parallel with the chat. It seems like there's a lively conversation there, which is awesome. I'm going to kick us off with an overarching question, and then if you guys have any more questions, please put them in the chat. I also know some of you submitted your questions, so I'm going to try to weave those in. So we'll see how far as we go, but I also put the book websites in the chat. So please make sure to check out these wonderful authors and all the brilliant work that they do. Buy their book for your teams, friends, and peers, because I think at this point you probably recognize how brilliant all of these minds and humans are. So please share the wealth. So let's get us kicked off to tying your books to the concept of human-centered leadership. And so I just want to tee that up by saying, and this came through some of what you guys said, I personally had become disenchanted with leadership books, quite frankly. I think the last leadership book I bought was Dare to Lead by Brené Brown. And since then, I haven't really bought leadership books. And because I was disenchanted by the fact that it felt like they recycled old, outdated concepts that didn't resonate anymore at all with me. And as I was reflecting on preparing this workshop, I also realized why all three of your books resonate so much with me, because in essence, they present concepts that are really simple, but also radical. And I think why they're radical is, and this is the t-shirt from HR.Hackathon Alliance, let's bring the human back to human resources. So I think similarly to how we've rationalized the human out of human resources, over the years, we have rationalized the human out of leadership, and we have turned our leaders in ever more robotic, quite frankly, machines to get out of people more productivity, more efficiency over the years, and we've lost the human. And so that's why your books are simple yet radical, right? Because amidst this is kind of a new way of looking at it. So my question to you all is, how do you think each of your leadership approaches tie back to the concept of human-centered leadership? And when I say human-centered leadership is, yes, centering back on the human, but also in the concept of human-centered design. What we are all about here with the HR.Hackathon Alliance and my work with design thinking is applying approaches from human-centered design, like empathy, co-creation, and experimentation to your leadership style. So I'm just going to open it up, whoever wants to start the conversation.
Okay, I'll go, but I won't have a long answer. I feel that, as you said, we are being robotized to death. This is only going to be exacerbated by AI, which is pretty depressing, I feel, especially in times of increasing disparity, social inequalities, and so on. This is not going to end well. So it is really time. We see that already in society. We see with populist movements and the extremes, and people are angry. They are not yet angry at work. They are disengaged, which is already not great. So is the solution to replace everybody by GPT and machines and robots? I'm not sure. Or is it to try to, to reconnect with the fact that leadership is something done by people, with people, and hopefully for people?
Julian, LaTonya, do you want to add, or should we go to another question? All right, seems like we move on, and I want to take a question from the chat. So Rhonda asks, I really resonate with the small actions of leadership versus big aspirational theories or frameworks. What would you each say is a helpful small action or step for human-centered leadership?
Read these books. Julian.
Sorry, LaTonya, did you want to go? Okay, I'll be quick. I think the thing that I always try to remember is that organizations aren't real. They're just made up. In fact, most of the stuff that surrounds us is made up. Our systems of civil society, our legal frameworks, our educational frameworks, our systems of fairness, and indeed our structural systems of unfairness and discrimination. They are made up. They are a common consensual delusion. What's real are people. And if we truly believe that, we have to ask ourselves almost in every day how we are accountable to each other. I was working with a chief executive of a financial service organization that's been rationalizing its parental policies, and it's a good organization and great people and so on and so forth. And what they've ended up doing is taking something away from some people and giving something to other people. And he was describing to me a group of troublemakers who are creating a fuss about these changes, and showed me the letter they'd written, and it was just a beautiful letter. And I said to him, you understand that what they're saying is right, that you talk about your organization having social purpose, and you talk about your organization being fair. And I read this letter and I think, yeah, they are waving the flag, they are doing the right thing. And you have to reconcile the fact that they are doing the right thing and you are doing the right thing. You're just measuring right in different systems. You're saying you can't afford it, which may well be correct. You can't crash an organization just to give everybody what they need, but neither can you make them the enemy because they are asking for something which is reasonable. You have to be more open and in dialogue with yourself and with other people. So it's not just about putting people back into the center of systems, it's recognizing that people come before systems. And I think that is, how I'm seeing that, people first.
LaTonya?
Yes,
Looks like you got things on your mind.
Some construction. It's Chicago in the summertime.
Yeah.
So there's yeah, I think it's really one of the things I talk about is instead of responding to something how you want to, just kind of note how it's making you feel. Like, especially when you're uncomfortable. This is like a really small action you can take. So instead of, trying to respond to a person where you feel offended, or a person where you want to make a judgment on them, instead of doing that in leadership, just take a minute and just explore what's going on with you. Like, why are you uncomfortable? Like, what is making you feel that way? Like, what's going on in your body? And just kind of getting awareness around that. I think the big problem we have is people just aren't aware of who they are and why they respond how they do. And I think to both Julian's and Celine's point, I think there are all these labels of what we're supposed to be. And we kind of think of ourselves that way, but we don't really know ourselves. All we know is we're feeling uncomfortable, but we don't really explore that. We just move on and we're, oh, I'm going to tell them, or I'm going to do, but just take a minute and get to know yourself and understand, you know, why you respond the way you do. And I think that is the number one tip I would give you with a small step, because so many people don't even know themselves. They don't know why they respond angrily. They don't know why they respond judgmentally. They don't know any of that. And if the more you can understand that, the better you can show up as a leader.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think this is the perfect way to close us out. We are at the hour, and I know there were some additional questions that all of you had. So feel free to reach out to the authors directly. I'm sure they would be happy to answer any of your additional questions. Again, I want to thank you so much, LaTonya, Celine, Julian, for being here. Especially Celine and Julian also to be here on a Friday afternoon from Europe. LaTonya here on a holiday weekend in the US. All of you being here listening to this super important topic. Again, buy their books, support them. This is such an important dialogue we need to have about leadership. And I'm looking forward to seeing everybody at a future HR.Hackathon Alliance event. Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much. Bye. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye. Cheers.